In June of 2020, in the midst of one of the most trying times in recent memory, people were desperate for some kind of escape to distract them from the stress of the real world. Many people turned to video games for this escape, which was only furthered by the surprisingly timely release of games like Persona 5 Royal, Doom Eternal, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and most notably, Animal Crossing New Horizons, which almost single-handedly skyrocketed the sales of the Nintendo Switch, and eventually went on to become the system's second best-selling title, behind only Mario Kart. This intensified public interest in games made it seem like the perfect time for Sony and Microsoft to unveil their next generation of consoles, and on June 11th, Sony hosted their Future of Gaming livestream, unveiling the PlayStation 5 alongside a ton of titles in development for the platform. And while most of the showcase's highlights were from larger AAA studios, namely Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, Spider-Man Miles Morales, Resident Evil Village, and Horizon Forbidden West, there were a few indie games that stood out, namely Bugsnax, which ended up being a free launch title for PlayStation Plus members, Stray, an incredibly unique adventure game featuring a post-apocalyptic world from the perspective of a cat, and of course, Goodbye Volcano High. This unique visual novel with rhythm elements was being developed by Co-op, a workers' cooperative based out of Montreal, and it's actually only their second non-mobile game release. Their first was Nog, a visually stimulating puzzle game released in 2017. So at first, Goodbye Volcano High seemed like a massive departure from what they usually developed. Out of all the games announced in this presentation, GVH was one of the ones that stood out to me the most. Its unique style, character designs, and the clear passion the devs had for the project made it stick in my brain, but the core concept was perhaps the aspect that hooked me on the game the most. See, I graduated high school in 2020, and due to the events that were shaking the world around that time, I had a very different senior year than just about every single class before mine, and everyone since. That March, I'd flown out to Washington, D.C. with my class for a student media convention, only for it to get cancelled as soon as we stepped off the plane. As the unnamed virus began to sweep over the world, we were stuck in Washington, D.C. until we were able to get a flight back home. It was eerie. Businesses and restaurants were still open, but people were starting to become much more cautious. My classmates constantly checked the news, worried for their elderly family members back home, and warily avoided my brother as he got sick. Thankfully, he didn't have that sickness, but still, the experience left an undeniable impression on me. And when we were finally able to return home, school had been canceled. My last day of high school had been the previous Tuesday, and I hadn't even known it at the time. I was left at home with my family for a month before the school even figured out how to get things running online, and even then, it wasn't the same. So, a few months later, seeing a game about high schoolers living through an uncertain time, facing their own mortality and the fact that it seems like the world might just end before they get to grow up? Yeah, it's easy to see why that resonated with me. The game was originally meant to release in 2021, but this obviously didn't happen. It was delayed repeatedly due to issues with remote work, a massive narrative reworking in 2021, and anti-LGBTQIA harassment, but it eventually did release on August 29th of 2023. I immediately bought the game on Steam and finished my first run throughout a few sessions in the first 24 hours. I wanted to slow myself down and savor the game, but its story, music, and characters just kept pulling me back in. I was overall blown away by how much I loved it, though the game does feature a few technical issues and some minor drawbacks I'll get into later. But it's very important to recognize what this game is and what it isn't right out of the gate. Otherwise, if you go into this game expecting it to be something else, you're naturally going to be disappointed. Firstly, this is not a traditional visual novel. Goodbye Volcano High uses a unique combination of animation, backgrounds, and voice acting combined in real time to tell its story, rather than the character stills and text boxes of most visual novels. The game has to quickly change between different voice lines and animations due to the choices you as the player make, which does lead to some minor technical issues as the backgrounds load in late, lip syncing sometimes doesn't match up with what the characters are saying, and some lines get cut off here and there before they're finished. However, these issues generally correct themselves fairly quickly, and the overall style the game creates is extremely immersive, like you're playing an interactive animated series. The amount of work put into creating these unique animations and the like also means that the story doesn't branch as much as some other visual novels, which leads me into my second point of what this game is not. This is not a choose-your-own-adventure game. This is a fairly linear story with a definitive beginning, middle, and end that cannot be changed at their core. The choices you make as Fang define the relationships with the game's 7 major characters, and based on how you play, who you favor, and how you treat everyone, the way each character feels about Fang and vice versa will shift throughout the story. This can be tracked via this little social circle icon on the pause menu. Some scenes are even exclusive based on choices you make, leaving each playthrough to have some slight differences that provide a new spin for the same general story. In my first playthrough, I focused on Nasser, Sage, and Naomi's stories, while in my second playthrough I've leaned more so toward Trish and Reed. I've been trying to get closer to Stella and Rosa too, but no matter what I do, they've always stayed on the outer edge of my circle, so I clearly must be missing something important about their characters. Finally, the last important thing to understand about this game going in is that it is not a rhythm game. It's a visual novel with rhythm segments. All in all, there are only 5 rhythm sections in the entire game, 6 if you count a more difficult version of a previous one being played back-to-back with another song. Given the game's roughly 6-hour length, this means that there's about one every hour, though they're not spaced out evenly. They also aren't super difficult, and your performance in them doesn't have any effect on the story, so really, they're just here to add variety to the gameplay, and I think they achieved that fairly well. The game's marketing made it seem like these rhythm sections would be a much larger part of the game, which led me to be a bit disappointed when there were so few rhythm sections overall, but looking at the game now that it's been a few weeks since my first playthrough, I feel that the rhythm sections it has work very well to add a better sense of immersion to the game. Speaking of the rhythm sections, the music in this game is absolutely phenomenal. The soundtrack was composed by Dabu, who's previously composed for games like Dwarf Fortress and one of Co-op's mobile offerings, Winding Worlds. And this soundtrack absolutely sells the themes and tone of each scene it's used in perfectly, with Fang's vocals being done by, I hope I'm pronouncing this name right, Bridget Nagar. Her voice really completes each of the rhythm sections, and I doubt I would be as attached to this soundtrack as I am without it. My personal favorite songs are Don't Call from the Battle of the Bands audition and Pretty Heroes from the game's finale, though Reunion is also a standout and probably has my favorite instrumentation of the bunch. Anyways, talking more broadly about the game and its story and gameplay, the game follows Fang as they make their way through their senior year of high school, trying to ensure their future career in music with their band, Worm Drama. Eventually, some conflicting interests arise among the band's members, and Fang struggles to keep them together, especially when reports about a potentially world-ending asteroid entering their solar system become more and more real with each passing day. There's a lot more to the game's story than that, of course, but that's the general premise. And honestly, I like how small it is in terms of scope. There's no big rush to try and prevent doomsday, no apocalyptic looting and life-or-death drama. It's just this group of high school friends trying to make sense of their own mortality, their dreams that won't come true, and the fact that they probably won't have a future. It's less about the apocalypse itself, and more about how the characters cope with knowing that the end of the world is coming. The main cast includes the aforementioned Fang, Worm Drama's vocalist and the game's protagonist, their brother Nasser, who's dragged down by the burden of being their parents' favorite child, Trish, the band's guitarist and bug enthusiast, Reed, a tabletop RPG master and drummer for Worm Drama, Naomi, the student council president with countless plans for her future, Rosa, a childhood acquaintance who Trish recently reconnected with, Sage, an aspiring cook who's all about his adorable aesthetic, and Stella, Sage's best friend with a knack for fortune-telling. These characters can be directly impacted by the choices you make throughout the story, and the decisions that do so are indicated by this tarot card symbol in the top left corner of the screen, which is different from when the same symbol is used in the bottom right to indicate the game is being saved, but in practice it's not super confusing, I promise. Some of these characters, particularly Naomi, Nasser, and Trish, are more intrinsically linked with the game's main story, but others like Sage and Rosa will barely be a part of the game unless you go out of your way to make decisions that bring you closer to them. However, the ones that have larger roles are a lot more easily impacted by your decisions, and have some of the most drastic changes in where they can end up by the story's finale. Particularly Naomi, whose story was my absolute favorite out of them all. The way the game visualizes Fang making their decisions is really interesting too. Different options will sometimes have different visual effects indicating the tone or emotion linked to each one, and if the decision is particularly impactful or difficult for Fang to say, the game forces you to hold down the triggers in order to make it. This is all extremely immersive, really putting you as the player in Fang's shoes, and making you feel what they feel. My personal favorite aspect of this, though, is the way that they play around with indecision and self-doubt. For some choices that require Fang to be very open, if you hesitate or try to select them at all, the option will disappear and change into something else, showing that inner insecurity through gameplay. It's honestly a genius way to visualize this, and not something I've seen a game do up till now. This decision-making visual novel gameplay will make up the vast majority of your time with Goodbye Volcano High, but there are a few minigames throughout it that flesh out the gameplay and give you a short break from the visual novel stuff. There's of course the aforementioned rhythm game sections, where Fang and sometimes Worm Drama perform or practice their music, and these are relatively simple. Just press the right buttons in time with the music and angle the analog stick towards some of the incoming notes. That's really all there is to it. They do progressively get more difficult as the game goes on, but nothing that I would put on the level of actual rhythm game difficulty. I managed to get the trophy for getting 90% or above on every performance during my first playthrough, but then again, I have some experience with dedicated rhythm games, so I'd be curious to know how people who aren't as familiar with the genre felt about this. Regardless, as I said earlier, how well you do in the rhythm sections doesn't affect the story at all, so if you're bad at rhythm games, don't let that stop you from giving this game a try. The game's other major minigame is Legends and Lore, a tabletop RPG that you'll play with some of the game's main cast at 3 points in the story. This plays out just about how you'd expect, and also very similarly to the core gameplay, with your decisions leading to slightly different outcomes and many actions being decided by dice rolls. This is also an excellent way to level up your affinity with the more difficult characters like Rosa and Sage, as there are clear decisions in these L&L sessions that those characters prefer, such as doing team attacks with them or deciding to go along with their plan of action rather than another character's. It also provides a nice break from the weight of the main plot, being a little bit more silly and lighthearted, except for a few key moments. Aside from those two, there are a few one-off minigames like designing your band's logo and posters, rummaging around Fang's bed for their MIDI controller, and searching the school for Trish's pet worm, Mango. These are generally very short and sweet, but they offer a nice bit of extra flavor dialogue with some characters, and in the case of the first two, you actually get to see your creation show up later in the game. They serve as nice little distractions to change up the pace, and increase the immersion factor just a smidge, but not much more than that. There's also a social media feed and flashbacks. The social media feed allows you to see a peek into the lives of the rest of the world, and see how they're all coping with the apocalypse, while the flashbacks offer more context to events you're experiencing now through the game's main plot. The last thing I have to discuss in terms of non-spoilery story is the game's representation, particularly of transgender identities, which I think is handled extremely well. Fang's story is inherently a queer one, and it's impossible to tell this character's story without their non-binary identity, which is a hallmark of good representation. If you lean into Nazir's affinity as you play, you'll unlock a few more scenes that reveal info about Fang's relationship with their parents, and their struggle for them to accept Fang's identity, which is an all-too-real experience for countless transgender teens around the world. Heck, it's something I've experienced myself back when I fully came out in 2021. I still wanted and strived to keep my relationship with my parents, but they didn't fully understand me or why I identified the way I did, and that led to quite a bit of conflict between us at first. This is very much the kind of relationship Fang has with their parents, and to see that kind of experience represented so accurately in a game was a very welcome experience. There are a few other characters who identify as trans within the game, and I definitely want to discuss them, but I'll save those scenes for the spoiler section later on in the video. Unfortunately, we've now come to the part of the video I've dreaded talking about the most. Honestly, I debated whether or not I wanted to include this part at all, but given the fact that this has almost completely overtaken discussion of the game online, I feel I have to make my stance known here. As with pretty much any game featuring queer representation, as soon as Goodbye Volcano High was revealed, it quickly gathered a massive hate community dedicated to tearing the game down as much as they could, primarily on scummy places like 4chan, YouTube comment sections, and Twitter. However, this group went far beyond what many others like it have done, and produced what they called an anti-fan game, which mocks the original release and promotes transphobic alt-right themes. I will not be directly stating the name of the game or showing any footage of it, because I really don't want to give it any more attention than it's already gotten. But if you're curious for more specifics, the internet is right there and you can do your own research. The reason I bring this up is because I've seen so many people acting like these two games are somehow comparable in terms of quality and writing. Let me make this extremely clear. That fan game is a transphobic project dedicated to nothing but spreading hate to the transgender community and the developers of Goodbye Volcano High. They stole the developers' character designs and used them solely to mock the original product and twist it into an opposite of the message that the game was trying to convey. Its main plotline revolves almost entirely around convincing Fang to detransition, leading to the game's, quote, good endings, while in the only endings where Fang doesn't detransition, they end up as either homicidal or eternally depressed. This game was not made in good faith, and should never be used as any sort of comparison for the real GVH's quality. I hate that if I ever want to look at videos about GVH on YouTube or the game's Steam reviews, I'm bombarded with this hateful rhetoric. And let me make it clear that if you're part of this group, and you're just watching the video to be hateful in the comments, I have no tolerance for that sort of thing, and I will not hesitate to delete your comments. I know that most of you think you can behave this way because of the anonymity and the lack of consequence the internet gives you. You're not hurting me, you're not making me cry myself to sleep or regret my life choices, and I'm sure that similar things can be said for the developers. If anything, all you're doing is proving the point of the story the game tells about the trans experience. And the fact that the developers and others like them are able to thrive regardless of your hate shows that we'll continue to stay strong no matter what happens. Anyways, so now that that's out of the way, there are a few smaller things I'd like to mention before I dive into talking spoilers. First off, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that the game is actually missing a lot of quality of life features common in these sorts of games. There's no ability to save and load manually, which forces you to rely solely on the game's autosave. There's also no dialogue log allowing you to see lines that have recently played, which would have helped immensely when audio clips cut off early thanks to bugs and the like. You can also have only one save file, which is perhaps the most egregious error for a visual novel. It's a game that's meant to be replayed so you can connect with different characters and see different outcomes, so you'd think they'd at least give the players an option to save their old playthroughs once they're complete. There's also no chapter select, no way to replay the rhythm or L&L sections outside of the main game despite them being fairly self-contained, and when the game is priced at $30, I don't know, a lot of these features are standards of the game industry at this point, and indie games are usually very good about including stuff like this, so I'm surprised that this stuff isn't here. Speaking of the price, I do think that $30 is a little bit much for the amount of content the game offers. I mean, a single playthrough only takes about 6 or 7 hours to complete, and while there is variation on repeat playthroughs, the vast majority of the story is the same, and while the production values are high, I don't think that's enough to justify this price. Something like $20 or even $25 would have been much more reasonable for this game. And with all that said, I think it's about time to get into the spoiler section of this video, so if you haven't played the game yet, I'd stop watching now and come back once you have. That's pretty much all that's left in the video anyways, but it's going to be a fairly lengthy discussion of the game's story beats. So without further ado, here we go. So the game's main plot has 3 storylines that interweave and connect throughout it, the biggest plotline revolving around Fang's band, Worm Drama. Throughout the story, they're continuously pushing in an effort to win a spot in Battle of the Bands, and subsequently Caldera Fest, launching off Fang's plan to get them a career in music. However, as Fang begins to ask more and more of their bandmates, their best friend Trish begins to realize that going on tour with the band isn't what she wants for her future, and she'd rather go to college and study entomology. This creates a bit of a rift between her and Fang, especially after she puts her foot down and decides that Battle of the Bands will be her last show with Worm Drama. Fang does seem a bit thick-headed in some of these scenes, with the message not really getting through to them until after they win the battle. But then again, people can be so focused on their own goals and aspirations that they might lose sight of the fact that not everyone wants to go along with their plans. Heck, I've had to learn the same lesson pretty recently, and it's something I've continuously had to work on for my own personal growth. So while on my first playthrough I saw this scene as a little bit contrived, I eventually realized that the reason I didn't like it was because I saw too much of myself in it. Of course, winning a spot at Caldera Fest doesn't really end up mattering when it's cancelled because of, you guessed it, the imminent arrival of an extinction event, which makes up the game's second main storyline. Introduced as soon as the end of the game's first chapter, it plays around with this a ton, having it not really affect much of the game's plot at first, but it's always present in the background of the story with the characters still being in disbelief about whether or not the meteor is really going to hit them. This effect is extremely effective because we, as the players, know that it's real. We know that the meteor is eventually going to hit the planet and end the lives of all these characters we've come to love. But watching them go about their lives with this uncertainty lingering in the back of their minds is a fantastic way to explore this concept. And like I mentioned earlier, it draws a lot of similarities to the way the world felt during 2020. Apparently, the game was completely rewritten around 2021, and I can definitely see the inspiration the developers took from real-world events to inform this version of the story. And once the game's third act rolls around, this storyline takes center stage. The reality of the meteor has set in on the world, and our main cast is left struggling to make any sense out of it at all. This is when the story becomes its most emotional, with Fang trying to reconnect with Trish so they can face the end together, and the entire friend group struggling to come to terms with their own mortality, and the fact that their dreams will never come true. Especially Naomi, who takes her anger out on the entire group for one of the game's most impactful scenes. The campfire scene is genuinely one of the most beautiful parts of the game, allowing Fang to have a heart-to-heart with each of the characters you've poured the most time into throughout the game. In my first playthrough, I unlocked the scenes with Sage, Nazar, Trish, and Naomi, while on my second, I swapped out Sage and Nazar for Stella and Reed. I also looked up Rosa's online for good measure since I missed it, and whew boy, we'll get to that soon because it genuinely might be my favorite out of the whole bunch. But anyways, the two most important scenes here are easily with Trish and Naomi. Trish's scene leads to her and Fang repairing their relationship and coming to a better understanding of their friendship as a whole. They're still best friends, band or no band. Naomi's, however, requires some explanation of the third main storyline throughout the game, Fang's mystery crush. During the first scene where the meteor is introduced, a power outage leads to this mystery crush texting Fang and admitting their feelings. Since Fang doesn't have this person's number, they don't know who it is. The crush didn't expect for their message to actually go through though, but the two continue texting back and forth throughout the game, with the two of them even writing a song together eventually. And when this secret admirer comes to see Worm Drama at the Battle of the Bands, they reveal themselves to be Naomi. This reveal was a little predictable to me, but that didn't make the impact any less sweet. Unfortunately, in the aftermath of the battle, Fang isn't in the best state of mind, and says that they can't emotionally process Naomi's feelings at the moment. This eventually comes to its culmination in their campfire one-on-one, where the player can choose to have them become a couple or remain just friends. I had them become a couple in both playthroughs, because honestly, they were way too cute for me to separate them. Naomi's personality very much contrasts with Fang's. Whereas Naomi is the more on top of things, plan everything years in advance type, Fang is much more relaxed, just coasting through life. Naomi's involved in all of the extracurricular activities, being on the yearbook committee, the student government, the Young Engineers Club, while Fang is solely dedicated to their band. The two make for a really sweet pairing when they connect, and it skyrocketed Naomi to becoming one of my favorite characters in the game. I'm a sucker for cute romance stories like this. One of the other major things I want to talk about in regards to spoilers is the game's transgender representation. In total, there are 3 trans characters in the game: Fang, Sage, and Rosa. Fang's identity is by far the most prominent, which is natural with them being the protagonist, but like I mentioned earlier, the closer you get to Nazar, the more you see Fang struggle to be accepted by their parents. Nazar unquestioningly supports Fang's transition, but their parents deadname and misgender Fang on multiple occasions throughout the game, and have a clear struggle to connect with their child despite only appearing in the game a handful of times. And even then, their parents aren't physically present, only communicating through texts, notes, and video calls, since they're on vacation in Isla Nublar. Which, given the other fictional universe that uses that location, I'm a bit concerned for what became of them after the meteor hit. But despite this, it's clear to see the effect this has on Fang and their relationship with their parents. To see something like this represented so accurately in a game is a massive step forward for this genre and for the industry as a whole. But it doesn't stop there. Fang also has optional conversations with each of the other 2 trans characters about their identities, which serves to further explore their characters on a deeper level. In the case of Sage, you can choose to wait at the bus stop and run into them one day, where if you do, he'll have a conversation with Fang about his struggle to be taken seriously as a trans man. Despite still presenting with a cutesy aesthetic, his family doesn't take his gender identity seriously, and sees it mostly as just him playing dress-up, which is a very real experience for many trans men. Considering that so much trans representation in media is focused around trans women, it's incredible to see such a nuanced exploration of this topic in a game like this. And finally, there's the case of Rosa, whose identity is discussed in her campfire scene. Rosa and Fang discuss the intersectionality of their gender identities and their cultural identities, with Rosa being explicitly Latina, while Fang, Nazar, and their parents are implied to be of some Middle Eastern descent. I'm not knowledgeable enough on these cultures to be able to pick one out specifically, but if anyone else who's played the game knows, please let me know in the comments, I'm genuinely curious. Rosa talks about how the way that she was raised and the way her parents were raised make it very difficult for them to connect, which is only compounded with the fact that she's transgender. While her parents are supportive, much of her extended family is not, and many of them live in areas of the world where it would be dangerous for Rosa to travel, meaning she'll never be able to meet many of the family members who would have been accepting of her identity. Once again, this is an aspect of being trans that's so rarely explored in media, and to see it here, written so well, is an extremely welcome sight, and I really hope this game opens the doors for more stories like this to be told. With all of that said, though, the game ends on its highest note of them all. After the heart-to-hearts, the 8 friends regroup and decide that if Caldera Fest isn't happening, they'll make their own Caldera Fest to go out with a bang. Naomi and Fang have an adorable date and finish their song, which Fang goes on to sing at the concert, wearing an outfit Naomi handcrafted for them. Trish, Reed, and Fang have a beautiful moment the night before the concert, just hanging out and getting to be teens, distracted even for a moment from their impending doom. And right before the concert, Fang and Nasser call their parents, and Fang's mom finally calls them by their chosen name. It's a genuinely beautiful ending that made me tear up pretty quickly, and led to the game's ending being easily its strongest aspect. I know a lot of people are upset the game has only one ending, but I think that for the story this game is trying to tell, that actually makes it work even better. The game ends on a happy, hopeful note with hints of somberness rather than the doom and gloom of an impending apocalypse, and this makes the game's message stick clearly in the players' minds. As Fang says it, "Who needs a future when all my friends are here in the present?" But when applied to the real world, it becomes more, why worry about the future when all my friends are here in the present? And I think that's a beautiful note to end the game on, sharing a loud, joyful moment with all of the people who care about you, support you, and using that to inspire and make life just a little bit easier for others. And on that note, that's about it for this review. Thank you all so much for sticking around, and by the time this goes up, I'll likely have reached 1,000 subscribers, meaning I can finally monetize this channel. Being on YouTube and using this platform to share my opinions with the world has been something I've wanted to do since I was extraordinarily young. Heck, if I'm thinking back on it, I think the earliest I tried to do it was when I was like 11 or 12 years old. But the fact that my channel has finally taken off while I'm able to make content I like rather than feeling forced to follow trends means the world to me, and I couldn't have done this without all of your support. If you want to keep seeing videos like this or my monthly Splatoon videos, be sure to throw a like my way, comment down below, and subscribe so you don't miss future uploads. I also have a Discord server that's linked in the description, though I did discontinue my Patreon due to lack of interest and the fact that I'm not really sure if that's something I'm ready to commit to while I'm still at school. It's definitely something I'll consider relaunching in the future though. Anyways, hope you all have a fantastic day, check out GVH if you haven't already, and most of all, be kind to one another. I'll see you around.